Good morning, Dan and Amy. We turn our attention to the Chinese communists in advance of our next guest, and here we go. Boy, knocking me over with a feather. The Chinese COVID-19 cases have declined more slowly than government figures disclose. The Chinese being less than forthright with us
No, really?
about COVID-19. I'm stunned. By the way, you know who's actually done a good deal of flacking for the Chinese? In a sense, it's been subtle, not formal. Tony Fauci. There's a good piece by Angelo Codavia at amgreatness.com. He is the former academic at Boston University. He's the man credited with the term ruling class. We've had him on the show before. He points out sort of how Fauci massages some issues. For example, a reporter asked Fauci if he agreed with Trump that the Chinese have not been fully forthcoming about the scope of the pandemic. Fauci answered that although the Chinese had lacked candor in previous years, this time they had turned over the sequence of the virus, quote unquote, the sequence of the virus. They turned that over. Codavia comments, spoken like a wily swamp reptile. His words were factually correct. The Chinese had turned over all they knew about the virus's sequence, namely its genetic structure. But the reporter and the audience neither knew nor cared about that. They were interested in the Chinese government's misrepresentations of the virus's contagion, fatality rate, and so forth. That is what they had disassembled. That's what they had dissembled and lied about. Fauci's answer artfully deceived the audience into believing the opposite of the truth. Thus, Codavy argues, did Fauci help plant a dagger between Trump's shoulder blades and help his party, the Democrats and the deep state, extort the American people's compliance to their agendas? Codavia obviously sees something very malicious in Fauci's very guileful use of the language. For more on the Chinese communists, of course, is who we're talking about, those in charge of the Chinese government, President Xi and his gang of communist thugs. We're pleased to be joined by Weifeng Zhong, who is a senior research fellow at the Mercator Center at George Mason University. Weifeng, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and good morning to you, Dan and Amy.
Good morning. And so why don't we start with your data crunching on the COVID-19 numbers in China, the infection number of cases and associated data, and why their underreporting is important to us in the West.
Now, why they're importing is something quite obvious because they are always not very truthful about their numbers, and that's important to us because it matters to how the extent of our knowledge about what the Chinese government is up to and what it's going to do next. Because the U.S.-China rivalry is going to stay with us for decades, if not centuries, and so whether or not we know our opponent very well matters to a great deal.
And so give us a sense of how you come to the conclusion that the cases are declining more slowly than the Chinese communists are disclosing.
Absolutely. So over the past few months, my team and I have built an artificial intelligence program that tries to answer the question of how bad the pandemic really was in China as opposed to the numbers the Chinese government was telling us. And we do that by simply monitoring the Chinese propaganda machines, the national newspapers called the People's Daily, which is the mouthpiece, just like the China's version of Pravda. And the reason that might actually work is because words sometimes they speak louder than numbers if the numbers are fake. But then, it's easy for a government to lie about numbers. You just lied about the numbers. But when the government has to address the public on a public health crisis for days and weeks, in the words, sometimes they gave away the truth. Right? When they want people to stay at home, they shut down Wuhan. When they shut down Wuhan, for all we know, the entire nation was only reporting about fewer than 600 cases. But why do you shut down a city with 11 million people for fewer than 600 cases in the entire nation, right? And so this is how we came to, by monitoring the word, we saw a declining severity in how they use the words over time since March. But the decline is much more slowly than the decline of the official numbers.
Well, what about the death rate and the real death rate? Because I know they revised it on April 17th. So do you know what the real numbers are, or at least what they're reporting?
So unfortunately, by just looking at words in their propaganda newspapers, we don't conclude with a number, like exact numbers of how bad it is. But the conclusion we can draw is relative to the time it hit plateau. So our word-based measure shows that it hit plateau around February, which sort of checks out with the official numbers. But after that, though, so after the peak, it declines much more slowly than the official numbers.
You did a little bit of as part of your write-up, a comparison between the response to COVID, the Chinese Communist response to COVID, and the Chinese response to SARS back in 2003. And what was it you gleaned from the comparative analysis?
So that kind of comparisons are very useful in the sense that what happened before during SARS gave us a benchmark of the wax and wane, so to speak, of language, of what typically the government would say when the cases are rising and what they would say when cases are falling, when new cases are falling. And so when I said it, in this episode during COVID-19, when it shows that it declines more slowly, it means that even when official numbers are drastically declining, the government is using words during SARS when the case numbers were still very high. And so back in SARS, language went down with the numbers more consistently than this time. This time the language didn't really go down with the numbers. And so which means that they might be lying even more. So they might be lying back in SARS, but this time chances are they're lying even more than they did.
There was a piece in Foreign Affairs magazine that we kicked around with Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano from the Heritage Foundation yesterday that essentially argues that this coda of prevention and control, Fang Kong, is been sort of reasserted by President Xi. And what prevention and control means is a lot more restrictions on information flow in particular. That's the prevention. It's not prevention of disease. It's prevention of information. And the belief that, by preventing information and controlling its flow, then you can insert the Pravda-like propaganda that you were referencing earlier and, push people to this sort of belief in the harmonious China utopian vision and total compliance with the state.
I think that's right on. And so over the years, during the U.S. engagement with China, I think there are a few things that turned out to be quite surprising. One being that at the beginning of the economic reforms in China, a lot of people who were optimistic, they were hoping that by engaging, China would gradually turn to a free society, including having more freedom of speech. The media would not be under such heavy control by the Chinese government as it used to. But what turns out is it surprises to some people because, if anything, the media outlets in China owned by the state were under even more control by the state than they used to be.
Do you see, I know you haven't done an analysis in this, but just in terms of sort of the tone and tenor, you get sort of a feel for it. It's a little bit of art in addition to artificial intelligence. Similarities in some of the rhetoric that you hear from politicians in this country with respect to COVID-19. Just in terms of sort of the moving of the way that we keep score. First it was hospitalizations and death and flatten the curve. Now it's just focused on the number of infections, regardless of the severity. That's a significant change, and yet you still hear sort of the "we're all in this together," stay together inside, and all these various hashtag campaigns. Isn't this just a softer form of the same sort of state propaganda that you see in China?
Well, I wouldn't go too far, so far as to say that what we see in the U.S. is the same propaganda we saw in China. I mean, political communications, though, the words we see in media, they in nature have the function to change people's opinions and hence more change people's actions. So in that sense, media are just as powerful in the U.S. As they are in China. But I haven't done the same analysis you were alluding to using the U.S. data. But I do want to point out that all the programs we did under the Policy Change Index project are open source. So anyone who has U.S. media data who wants to plug the algorithm in to see what they find are free to do so.
Well, that'd be. I mean, it's just be interesting to look at. I mean, the way that you track some of these rinse and repeat lines that you hear over and over from politicians, across the country. It just is interesting, as you say. I mean, we have this sense in America sometimes that things that are bad that are happening in other countries, manipulation that occurs in other countries, well, that just doesn't occur here because we're a free society. And I think that's terribly naive.
I agree. So not to say that it doesn't happen in the U.S., but it does require doing the same analysis. It does require requires a researcher to be careful in terms of selecting what data sources
Sure.
They are going to use for the analysis. So in China, it's easy because they have a product-like newspaper. But then in the U.S., if you were to study politicians or to study the president, then you have to choose a different outlet, perhaps media
Yeah.
or some other platform.
You could spin a wheel and pick almost any beltway outlet and treat it the same way as the People's Daily, but I digress. I'm going back to China, actually. It seems to me a great illustration of this, in addition to your illustration here in terms of President Xi's handling of COVID-19 and the what your AI tells us about the language and what that may mean about their policy direction. I go back to this documentary, One Child Nation, about China's just ghastly and disastrous one-child policy for 35 years, up until it changed to a two-child policy a couple of years ago. And I mean, in addition to just the inhumanity of it, one of the things that really comes across in that documentary is the state propaganda, not just through the newspapers, but through TV too, and it's all the theatrics of it, and the village's participation in these art productions in support of the One Child Nation policy. It was remarkable how comprehensive it was and how many different forms it took. It wasn't just one newspaper. It wasn't just on your TV screen. You were essentially compelled or cajoled into being a participant in skits in service of the state's policy.
Right. So you're certainly right. And I think so. I do want to point out, though, that the phenomenon you were just mentioning, it's not that Americans or American policymakers did not know that from decades ago. So we know that it's authoritarian regimes with very heavy state control. I think what has driven much of our China conversation these days was that we didn't expect that China did not change a bit throughout all this time that we tried to integrate China into the global economic system. So what turns out to be not quite correct was that engagement we thought would change them, but it didn't quite as much.
No, it didn't. He is Weifeng Zhong. He's a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and I will tweet out his piece that explains this AI bot that he created, which, as he says, is open source. Weifeng Zhong, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.